Good afternoon, friends. Greetings on behalf of the 18 denominations that make up the North Carolina Council of Churches. I'm Jennifer Copeland, and I welcome you to our Critical Issues Seminar 2022, The Ties That Bind Democracy. We've got a great lineup of democracy all-stars this week who are going to remind you of all those topics you remember from civics in high school. Only this is going to be far more exciting than any civics class ever was. So exciting you might burst into your own version of Blessed Be the Tie that binds our hearts. But before we get too far on this first day, I want to pause and say some things about the Council's Distinguished Service Award and this year's recipient, Steve Ford. The Distinguished Service Award was first given by the Council in 1953. The Council was founded in 1935. I was intrigued by the numerical palindrome, but I don't think there's really any significance to that. What is significant is the award's legacy of honoring someone with an exceptional and extended record of service through the work of the Council. In other words, friends, these are the people who have brought us where we are today. We are standing on their shoulders. My predecessor, George Reed, gets to tell the best stories about Steve Ford because he has known Steve longer. But for my part, I want to state publicly that when I accepted this job, my forte was theology and preaching. It was not legislative acumen. But Steve changed all of that, probably without even knowing it. Steve showed me what to pay attention to and taught me how to cut to the chase. And more importantly, he showed me when to broadcast the Council's analysis of the legislative policies that bracket all of our lives. Lately, Steve has stepped back from his regular, consistent writing for the Council's Raleigh report, but we are always pleased to get an email from Steve saying, "I'm working on a little piece. You should have it by tomorrow." So Steve, thank you for insightful commentary, faithful service, and charming wit. George, he's all yours.
I am honored, Jennifer, to be invited to help in today's presentation of this Distinguished Service Award to Steve Ford. Thank you for asking me. As Jennifer has already said, this award is presented to those who have provided outstanding service to the Council, and Steve richly deserves it. But as I was thinking back on my time with Steve, I was reminded that he would also be eminently qualified for the Council's other award, the Faith Active in Public Life Award. It recognizes those who are people of faith and whose faith has motivated them to work in the public sphere for things the Council holds dear. If the Distinguished Service Award is for service inside the Council, the Faith Active is for service in the wider public world. I first knew of Steve when he was the editor of the editorial page at the News and Observer and wrote a weekly column. They were always must-reads, thoughtful, well-written, and often about issues the Council was working on. I was not surprised when I learned that Steve was a person of strong Lutheran faith. But enough about the Faith Active Award. Let's talk about Steve's distinguished service to the Council of Churches. I'll never forget getting a letter, an honest-to-goodness typed envelope in an envelope, a typed letter in an envelope that arrived in the mail one day early in 2013. It was from Steve. He said he'd like to do some work for the Council in his retirement. Might we have something he could do? Might we? The letter was modest, humble, not presuming that we'd have a place for him. I showed the letter immediately to Alita Payne, who was then the Council's communications director, and she responded with some version of, "You think?" The truth of the matter was that there were many groups in Raleigh that would have given their eye teeth to have Steve Ford writing for them. Steve knew our work and was especially supportive of the faith-based nature of our approach to public policy issues, and he reached out to us in his retirement. So Steve became a volunteer program associate covering the General Assembly on our behalf. He wrote analysis pieces for Raleigh Report on a regular basis. They got picked up by NC Policy Watch and other media just about all the time. He wrote about public education, voting rights, the responsibility of citizens to vote, the death penalty, care of creation, Medicaid expansion, gun violence, and more. And he almost always included the council's faith-based reasons for its positions. Steve, because of his time at the NNO and the credibility he had, enhanced the council's reach beyond just the people of faith associated with us. He gave added visibility and credibility to the council, not that it lacked either, but Steve's work for us extended the council's reach to places it might not have been otherwise. There's another important part of his service to the council. Alita was quick to comment when I talked to her last week on what a team player Steve was. When it came time to plan a legislative seminar, he was there in the middle of the planning meetings, making excellent suggestions for topics and presenters, and then being willing to extend invitations to those speakers. They hardly ever turned him down. When it came time for the seminar itself, he was there early with the rest of us, setting up tables, greeting people, and helping do those basic things that go into such events. He fully participated in the life of the council in so many ways. So, Steve, good colleague, great friend, congratulations on this much-deserved award, the council's 2022 Distinguished Service Award. Now, this is where if we were in print, we'd be clapping. But since we are here on Zoom and many of us muted, I'll just have to do that little bit of clapping for us. But Steve, congratulations. And now, Steve, we want to hear from you. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, George. And thanks to Jennifer and George for those wonderfully gracious, kind remarks. I really appreciate it. You've kindled a lot of memories just thinking back over this time that I've been with the council and the things we've tried to accomplish. I want to say good afternoon to all the friends of the Council of Churches and special greetings to our distinguished speakers, Mayor Roberts and Justice Orr. I'm honored to be found worthy of this award, and I accept it gratefully. Let me especially thank Jennifer for giving it her seal of approval and for her inspiring leadership, which I've seen firsthand since she came aboard 7 years ago. Can it be that long? And of course, my thanks also go out to George, Jennifer's noble predecessor, who welcomed me onto the council staff as a volunteer back in the spring of 2013. Well, what was I actually going to do? George has already recapped those discussions, but we sort of made it up as we went along with a strong assist from George's second in command, Alita Payne, my friend Alita. The hope was that I'd be able to leverage my experience writing about North Carolina's world of government and politics in ways that would further the council's mission of progressive, or as George would say, prophetic advocacy. If that hope has panned out, it's because George, Alita, Jennifer, and other valued colleagues supported my work and did what had to be done to get it distributed. And I'd also like to thank Rob Schofield, director of North Carolina Policy Watch, for kindly and without prodding, sharing many of my pieces with his readers, increasing the council's visibility and helping to boost its impact. I've appreciated as well the support and encouragement offered by past and present members of the council's governing board, who've had to figure out what to make of this old newspaper guy presuming to opine on the council's behalf. They include, but aren't limited to, Steve Hickel, Conrad Pridgeon, Jim Abbott, Russ Odie, Bob Hudak, Betty Hardy, and T. Anthony Sparrow. The council stands as a sort of a one-stop shop for social justice advocacy, in keeping with the values and priorities of its member churches. It promotes racial justice in all aspects, strong public education as a way to help people reach their potential, taxation that's adequate to support public programs, vital especially to the disadvantaged, including affordable health care, careful stewardship of the environment that's been entrusted to us, It's been a great privilege to help illuminate the challenges and mistakes in each of these areas. None of those challenges is greater at this point in our state and nation's history than the struggle to defend our democratic systems so that all citizens have a fair chance to participate in choosing their leaders. So this event is well-timed, well-aimed. I look forward to the insights of the presenters and again thank Jennifer and her colleagues for taking the time to recognize my efforts.
Thank you, Steve. And I should probably add my applause to Georgia so that we can all show our appreciation. And now let me tell you a little bit about today's Democracy All-Stars, which is what I'm calling our lineup for the week. Today we have Jennifer Roberts and Bob Orr. Jennifer Roberts began her contributions to society as a high school math teacher, a diplomat with the US State Department, an international banker, and teaching at UNC Charlotte. Elected to 4 terms as a Mecklenburg County Commissioner, she later became mayor of Charlotte. And that's when I noticed her. The environmental program arm of the council has always appreciated her environmental protection work, but soon all of us grew to appreciate her work on education, equality, and inclusion. She has won numerous awards, but let me highlight just a few that caught my eye. She has received the Maya Angelou Women Who Lead Award, the National Association of Women Business Owners Public Policy Leader of the Year Award, and Equality North Carolina's Ally of the Year Award. I wonder what year that was. And recently, I've had the privilege of working with Jennifer and her co-lead, former North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr, on the Carter Center Strengthening Democracy Project. Robert Orr began his contributions to society in the Army, where he was stationed in Germany. He since has practiced law in Asheville, served on the North Carolina Court of Appeals, and as you know, was a North Carolina Supreme Court Justice. He retired from the court in 2004 to head the newly formed North Carolina Institute for Constitutional Law, still going strong, by the way. Bob is known for his commitment to our park system, to refugee rights, and the constitutional rule of law. You can follow him on Twitter at Judge Bob Orr, and I have begun doing that. I highly recommend it. We are truly fortunate to have Mayor Roberts and Justice Orr tell us about their important work on the Carter Center Initiative to restore faith in established democratic norms and to keep the way clear for fair, safe, and secure elections in the coming midterm. Thank you, Jennifer and Bob.
Well, thank you, the other Jennifer, for that kind introduction. And it is terrific to see so many folks who are applying their faith to their civic responsibilities and to issues that impact all of us. And it is it is a very pivotal year. And we're going to tell you about why the Carter Center is doing work in North Carolina and how everybody who's listening can be part of that and can help and help us spread the word about how important it is to maintain our democracy. If we want, to achieve those goals that align with our faith in terms of loving our neighbor and caring for our communities, then we definitely need to pay attention to our democracy. So, and I'm really pleased to have Bob Orr be with me, and you'll be hearing from him in a minute. And I will start our slideshow here. So Rachel, thanks for advancing. Next slide. One of the things that the Carter Center noticed, and I'm sure all of you have noticed, is that we are a very polarized society. And if you look at the graph on the left, they have done this through survey data, through so many other data points in looking at how we are polarized. And that top line is the political polarization by party. We have gotten wider and wider apart, 14 points on average, and we've gotten to a point where we're not listening to each other. Today, the party divide is greater than any other divide, and that's getting a lot of people concerned. Next slide. So there are a lot of reasons that we are divided. We are a more diverse country now. Back in the 70s, we were only about 5% foreign born. Now we're more than that. I'm sure we're 15%, maybe even more. We have closed media ecosystems. What that means is that we listen to the same news source, and our news sources have become biased. There's always a bias to a reporter, the way that they view the world. But now we have Fox News on one side, MSNBC on the other, and most people just watch one. They don't hear another perspective. Both of those, by the way, started in 1996. We also have rising income inequality. We have a growing awareness of racial inequality, and a lot of that is because we have cell phones and videos, and people see some of the injustice that is occurring against Black and brown bodies. We have a declining trust in our institutions, and there are a lot of reasons for that. We saw that during COVID when people didn't believe what the health professionals were saying. We have politically homogeneous communities. I've heard people say that they moved to a certain neighborhood because they saw the yard signs were supportive of their political party. They didn't want to live in a neighborhood with folks from the other side. And we have what's called group status downgrade. That's a fancy way of saying people are concerned about replacement theory. People who have been in the majority are seeing that their status as the majority, as the party or the group in power is challenged as we become more diverse and people feel threatened. Fear is a great motivator. And that is one more thing that is polarizing us. Next slide. So this is just a quote from somebody even in 2018 writing that our political parties are becoming intrinsically aligned with our identities, so that a single vote can indicate a person's partisan preference, but also his or her religion, race, ethnicity, gender, neighborhood, and favorite grocery store. So you heard about the Whole Foods and the Democratic neighborhoods and the Walmarts and the Republican neighborhoods. Well, that's happening. And so what we call partisanship now is a mega identity, with all the psychological and behavioral implications that are there and magnifications. Next slide. The Carter Center and others have seen the threats to our democracy. Some of the things that are driving the increasing violence that we're seeing. And I don't need to tell you about the mass shootings, about so many things that we're seeing today, but even around democracy and elections, we have counter-majoritarian structures. And again, that's a fancy way of saying we have institutions like the Electoral College and the Senate that are not really tied to the numbers of people that are supporting a particular ideology or a particular party. So we don't always have a president elected by the popular vote because of the Electoral College. That leads to frustration with democracy. We also have those media silos I talked about, the lack of accountability that we see. People are not fact checking. There are so many different sources of information. We have a rapid flow of misinformation. And that is because it's just so easy to get it up on social media. And it's so easy to make something sound like it's reasonable, and it can be shared numerous times. This is not new, because Mark Twain said something like, the truth gets all the way around the world. Sorry, a lie gets around the world before the truth has time to put its pants on. But so this has been true for a while, but now it is magnified because of the prevalence of social media and the ease of its use. And obviously the last thing that we see that has led to the increasing violence is the prevalence of guns in our society. Next slide. In North Carolina, we see these issues playing out around schools with the critical race theory, with LGBTQ issues and transgender sports, mask wearing. There's so many different issues that are polarizing us. The redistricting. Justice Orr can talk a little bit more about that, because He was one of the special masters. The General Assembly and the governor being different political parties in that struggle. Faith-based exclusions, concerns about religious exemptions, that's playing out around the country. Racial injustice, recent court cases, not just gerrymandering, but so many others, the concern about the Supreme Court, and then of course, the urban-rural divide, which is very obvious in North Carolina. Next slide. We know from survey data that 36% of Americans are concerned about the traditional American way of life disappearing and are willing to use force to save it. Among Republicans, it's 55%. Democrats is somewhat less than 50%. But again, we're seeing this throughout our communities, and that is concerning. Next slide. The Princeton University has an initiative called the Bridging Divides Initiative. The Carter Center is working with them to identify where are the parts of the country that are the most susceptible to political violence. And there are a number of factors that they looked at. They're continuing to hone in on things that might indicate future incidents. I'm gonna sound like your financial advisor here and say that, you know, past performance is no absolute predictor of future performance, which means in North Carolina, as you can see, we have several counties in the top 112 of all the counties in the country for indicators of possible violence. But just because we've had it in the past doesn't necessarily mean we'll have it in 2022. But it means we should be paying attention in case it does and be preparing for it. So the factors they look at, the Princeton data folks have looked at polarization and social trust, mobilization, that's the number of people who go to protests and how far they travel and how many show up, potential for violence, and that's based on actual violence that has occurred in different protests or gatherings, hate crimes, that kind of thing, and political relevance. That means, gee, I wonder which states have a really important US Senate race. North Carolina. So political relevance, you know, how much is at stake in some of the elections that are going on? As you can see on the right, in their most recent data collection, this was done in December of 2021, we had several counties in the top 100, and only California and Florida had more counties in the top 100 when you look at those four aspects of polarization. Not surprising, Wake is the tops. In the initial Princeton outreach and data collection, it was number 12. And again, every month they update this because the numbers of protests and the incidents, et cetera, have to be factored into their algorithm. Guilford and Mecklenburg, not surprising in the tops, Alamance, New Hanover, Durham, Cumberland, and Buncombe. So those are, again, there's some population centers in there, and we know that we've seen incidents occur, and we know that we do have hate groups present in North Carolina. That picture on the left, by the way, that's a photo I took the first day of the George Floyd protests in Charlotte. The gentleman in front, I was careful not to get too close. He's draped in a North Carolina flag, but he has an AR-15 rifle slung over his shoulder, and it was real. Next slide. This is just the graphic that the Princeton University uses. You can see the index score on the right. And so the darker colors, of course, are the ones that ranked higher in polarization, in mobilization, in the history of violence. So you can see in the history of violence, our North Carolina counties are not as high as the numbers who show up at protests and that sort of thing. So again, we know that we have people who are willing to show up, to have their voice heard, which is great. Just having a protest is not a bad sign, but having some violence connected with that and having the mistrust and the polarization connected to that makes us pay attention. Next slide. So how did the Carter Center get involved? Well, the Carter Center started in 1982, and President Carter and Rosalynn Carter are focusing the center's efforts on three things. They are interested in strengthening democracy, resolving armed conflicts, and fighting disease. So it's about strengthening democracy, waging peace, as they say, and fighting disease. When they saw rising polarization in 2020, that picture, by the way, is the two of them in the West Bank actually overseeing some elections there. But in 2020, the Carter Center started to look at what it had learned overseas in elections monitoring, strengthening democracy in places like Sudan and Venezuela and the West Bank. They started to look at the US. Next slide. And this quote is terrific in terms of saying what we need to do in the US. In the name of goodwill, we need to downplay our differences. On the contrary, many of us have a certain sense to be proud of our differences. They arise from goodwill, from love of country, concern for the challenges of our time, for respect, and even downright enjoyment of the democratic process of debate. Indeed, from the time of Thomas Jefferson, frank debate has been a part of the tradition of our republic. Our differences attest to the greatness of our nation. And I can think of no other country on earth where two political leaders could disagree so widely, yet come together in mutual respect. To paraphrase Mr. Jefferson, we are all Democrats, we are all Republicans because we are all Americans. That quote is from President Reagan, who was there at the opening of the Carter Center in 1986. I'm not sure that we would hear that kind of a speech today, but it encapsulates the benefits of our democracy so well, and the need for us to listen to the other side and to try to get past our polarization. Next slide. So here's what the Carter Center has asked myself and Bob Orr to try to do to help support fair, safe, and secure elections. They're starting with 4 states. These 4 came in the top categories of what the Princeton Data Project looked at. So Arizona, we see them in the news, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. So they're operating in 4 states in a very similar fashion. Each state is a little bit different because of cultural differences, but they're trying to do the same thing in terms of bolstering and strengthening democracy. So our strategy is to build a bipartisan leadership team, starting with myself and Bob, to help organize the work, to build this network of cross-partisan leaders across the state, and grow support from organizations and grassroots groups like the North Carolina Council of Churches, to grow a list of endorsers to a set of principles that we have put together that are basically basic democratic principles about how elections should operate. Now we're also doing a 14-district roadshow to restore trust in each district. We plan to have a gathering. I'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to plan some workshops and public service announcements to share a message of support democracy, follow the rules. And we want to have that engagement happen before, after, and during elections. Next slide. So on those first 2, Bob and I got it started. We've had several meetings with our cross-partisan network, and Jennifer Copeland is part of that. If others of you listening want to be part of it, please let us know. And we are also signing on organizations. That's just a picture of a Zoom meeting that we had with some of our advisors. You might recognize, Mayor Richard Vinroot is in there, former Representative Charles Jeter. Might be a few other faces in there. You recognize Harry Taylor, who was a candidate for Congress. In any event, it's very cross-partisan. We have some Republicans, some Democrats, some unaffiliateds, and we are going to continue to grow that network. So again, let us know if you're interested. Next slide. Some of the groups we're reaching out to, and not all of these have signed on, but we are definitely reaching out, and you can see there are groups on the left, groups on the right. We do have support from the League of Women Voters. We do have support from the American Sustainable Business Network. And again, we'll continue to try to get more of these groups to sign on. We are going to have a website very soon where groups and individuals can actually go on and sign on directly. It's not up yet, but we will be sure to let you know. Next slide. Here are the election principles that, again, we've gotten many, many people to endorse on the right and the left. Basically, that candidates should be honest. They should have civil campaigns. We should respect voters' freedom to exercise their right to register and vote without intimidation, without harassment. That we believe both political parties should have the ability to watch the process and to have observers. And we also, the last one is we want candidates and campaigns to follow the law, follow the legal remedies, and acknowledge the legitimacy after results have been certified and all contestations have been decided. So it's basically supporting the system that we have, because it's a system that has been working for hundreds of years. We've had to amend it, but we continue to support that. Next slide. And this is just a list of some of the folks that we have who have endorsed. And again, you'll recognize some names on the left and the right: the former president of the NAACP, other former Supreme Court justices. Wonder who reached out to them. Some people who are, again, former elected officials, some people who are business leaders, some people who are academics. And again, we are going to continue to grow this list. We want to make sure that it is cross-partisan. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, did we lose our administrator? Or do we, I'm still speaking. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Great, super. Okay, so somehow the next slide is, oh, there we go. So the next thing we're going to do is in August and September, and you can see the list of cities. We are going to have a 90-minute to 2-hour meeting in each of these cities with local election officials, with lawyers from the Democratic and the Republican parties to talk about legal remedies, with cybersecurity experts who are going to say it's very hard to hack elections. You hear about Russian involvement. Our elections in North Carolina are not on the internet. They're on hard drives. They are on flash drives. And they're going to talk about some of those things that people are concerned about. I just put a funny picture of an old bus to say that's, that's what our road show is going to be. Bob and I are going to ride around in that. No, I'm just kidding. But we do hope that that people who are concerned will show up and will be reassured that there is a lot of redundancy. There are a lot of checks and balances. There are preparations in case there are things that are closed during storms. There's a lot of backup. We want people to trust the process and to see that the election officials are their neighbors that have been doing elections for years and know how the process works. Next slide. So the next slide is all about how we're going to help support shared identities and shared values. The Carter Center will be working with a media firm to put out some messaging. Everyone is going to be able to follow this on social media. And again, the idea is to get some messaging out there that everyone can share. This is just a sample of what happened in Pittsburgh after the synagogue shooting there. They incorporated it into the Steelers logo, which was really beautiful. Next slide. And the next slide shows some of the things that they did in Georgia during the Senate runoff. Again, using some messaging. The average election official has worked in 7 previous elections, and they are Democrats and Republicans. We can trust them. There was a cute picture of the Georgia Bulldog against a Georgia Tech Yellow Jacket. So again, using symbols people will recognize to talk about, let's get past our polarization. We know that campaigns are competitive, but we also know they need to follow the rules, and we need to accept results in the end. Next slide. Finally, we are going to continue engagement after elections. We'll have processes in place to help message afterwards. If there are recounts, if there are contests, if people are unsettled, we want to be cross-partisan, show that we're working together, share those identities, and think long-term, because we want our state and our country to have our support. We want to be able to live through difference, to accept difference, and to see that it does make us stronger, and not to demonize and dehumanize people who think differently than we do. So we're thinking long-term. The Carter Center, of course, will be engaged in 2024 as well. Next slide. And so Bob's going to tell you about how you can help and his perspective on this. Bob, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And first, let me just thank the Council of Churches, not just for putting on this particular program, which certainly is timely and important to the well-being of our state, but also for all the many things you do on a variety of issues across North Carolina. And let me also add my congratulations to Steve Ford for an honor most deserved. There may not be anybody else on this Zoom call who has been on the pointed end of some of Steve's editorials or columns over the years. That comes with holding public office. And I would say, at least on those editorials, Steve got most of them right, but I'm sure all his work for the Council of Churches was spot on and 100% on the money. So as Jennifer said, we're in this because the Carter Center reached out looking for a, as they say, cross-partisan or bipartisan team to try and bring some sense of messaging to citizens in North Carolina about fair, safe, and secure elections. There's been a great concern across the board about potential violence in elections. We saw that coming out of the 2020 election. And so the idea of the Carter Center, having worked in democratic elections around the world, was that maybe we can do something in the United States that will strengthen confidence in the election system and be a major step forward in eliminating the threats or possibilities of violence surrounding the electoral process. I think it was noted that this might be an exciting presentation. I would say this may be a challenging presentation. And I think Jennifer and I, from the very beginning, and I guess Jennifer's been in this now for almost 8 months, it's a big challenge. I think Jennifer would have to admit that in trying to find a Republican co-chair, it took a while, and ultimately they had to fall back on a recovering Republican. Now I'm unaffiliated and have been since after January 6th, but I'm about as close as they could come, I guess, in finding somebody that we could represent this as a bipartisan effort. But I think the challenge is, and we talk about democracy under stress. In talking to Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated, there's a lot of awareness and concern that, yes, our democracy is under stress. Unfortunately, when you talk to Republicans, they think the problem is the Democrats. When you talk to Democrats, the problem's the Republicans. And so our challenge, and this has been more so from trying to find Republicans who would participate in this effort, spearheaded by the Carter Center, which for better or worse, accurately or inaccurately, is considered maybe a Democrat-leaning entity. It has been a challenge. And so as Jennifer has noted, we've come up with really sort of three main projects to try and bring in Republicans, Democrats, and some unaffiliated to work together and to listen. And I think the theme of your program, the ties that bind our democracy, is critical, because there are ties that bind us all together, as Jennifer noted in the quote from President Reagan. The difficulty is those ties are fraying, they're broken, they're cut. And the challenge for our effort is to see what we can do to reconnect those ties. And I think the faith community is an important, if not critical, component, because even though we have separation of church and state, we have in this country historically had a real reliance on the connection that our faith communities across the country and across denominations and across particular faiths have had. And so there's a really important role, I think, for your organization and others to figure out ways that we can reconnect, and particularly reconnect around the common themes, the common beliefs, the common tenets. And I have two large golden retrievers who will bark for a minute and then they'll lie down. So one of the real challenges that we're facing both in the project and I think nationally, the old Cool Hand Luke quote, what we got here is a failure to communicate. You know, we are not doing a good job in communicating with each other. And I think one of the things that this Carter Center project is geared to is to try and get people talking about the ties that really do connect us, as opposed to the issues and policies that divide us. And, you know, again, probably no large institution is better situated to do that than faith communities. And even though, you know, we see church attendance is arguably dwindling in parts of the country, many of our congregations have people of different political persuasions, of different political ideologies, and yet they're all there on Sunday for church, or they're participating in a variety of programs. And so as part of what we're hoping to accomplish is to bridge this communication gap and to start tying communities, political parties together on what unites us, as opposed to the suspicion and distrust that we have of each other. And that's one of the real insidious problems that we're facing in the effort, and that I think our communities are facing, is Republicans don't really trust the Democrats, and the Democrats don't really trust the Republicans. And so how do you work together if you don't have at least some basic level of trust? So I think one of the things that, and I'm just going to sort of randomly put out a couple of thoughts. we tend to misuse terms. We're in a social media age, and Jennifer, thanks for the plug for my Twitter account. People my age probably shouldn't have Twitter accounts, but anyway, it's been sort of an interesting communication device. But like we talk about fraud in elections. Now, there is a specific difference between fraud and bad policy or just policy decisions. For many years we had no early voting. You voted on election day. Maybe you got an absentee if you were in the military or you were out of the country. But now there's this big controversy over early voting sites. And this may be a controversial statement, but I'm going to say it. Both parties, while espousing we're all for fair elections, they all would like a little advantage. And so whoever's in control of the Board of Elections, whoever's in control of the government will be interested in getting a little bit of an edge. But that's not fraud. That's just, I think Jennifer quoted one of the Georgia participants in this effort, that's electioneering. We may not agree. We may not agree on how many early days for voting we have, but it's different from showing up with 2 or 3 stuffed ballot boxes and trying to tip the election for one candidate or another. That's fraud. And I now have here. I'll show you, Judge. Where are you, Judge? He's right there. I've got this dog driving me crazy. I'll do the best I can. All right, lie down, buddy. So, I think our candidate principles, they're really straightforward and simple. We need you to encourage candidates in your communities, whatever the political stripe, people in your congregations, to encourage candidates to endorse these principles. Our road show that Jennifer and I are putting together will need a lot of help. We'll need a lot of participation. But the idea is to make sure that people in North Carolina understand how elections work, and that if there's a problem, you don't go get a gun. You arguably go get a lawyer and you go to court, or you go through the Board of Elections process, and whatever that final decision is, that's the way it is. You don't resort to violence in response. We're going to need media attention, and I do want to emphasize what Jennifer said about this being a long game. The Carter Center's big concerns are the presidential election in 2024. So to a certain extent, we're kind of laying the groundwork in this 2022 effort to really hit the ground running once the election cycle starts for the presidential election in 2024. I would encourage you as a faith community to open dialogues with others in the broader faith community that maybe have a very different political perspective than you and your congregations. It is critical, I think, to the success of this effort that we don't just have liberal denominations, but we have conservative denominations who are buying into these candidate principles and to fair, safe, and secure elections. And although this is maybe a little sensitive, I would encourage you to hold people who are in the political world accountable for honesty and fairness. I mean, the one topic that you have for this week that I hope you get into is all this dark money. I mean, what, $11 million spent by Republicans to savage Pat McCrory, who you may like or not like, but I mean, this huge amount of outside money distorting the truth and tilting elections is maybe in a lot of ways more dangerous to the well-being of democracy than redistricting reform and gerrymandering, although those are obviously important. So let's see, I think that pretty well covers what I wanted to talk with folks about. We have an opportunity to take some questions, and Jennifer and I are ready to go.
Absolutely. And there was a good question that came in about what role the media will play in this. Right now we have someone researching media groups in the towns where we're going to be doing those town halls to try to get local papers and local stations to cover those. It's going to be very important. We have not had a public big media launch yet because we keep waiting for the website. Some things take time, but at some point we will have a public launch, and we do hope to get some articles on this initiative. And I know the Assembly, I don't know if anybody here gets the Assembly, it's a monthly newsletter, but they are interested, and when we're ready to go, in that public launch, they will probably write some kind of a story on what we're doing as well. Bob, did you want to add anything to that about the media and its role?
No, I mean, we have a changing media. I mean, that's, from the days when Steve was at the NNO, it's a whole different world. So we're trying to tap into social media, trying to work with smaller papers. But the important message is that our election system, we just went through a primary, and I think there were minimal issues. And we need to restore confidence. And obviously the Republicans, at least from a polling standpoint, tend to be the ones that don't trust the election system. But I think they confuse issues about how many early voting days and where early voting takes place and when absentee ballots have to be in. They take that as fraud, and that's just a fundamental mistake on their part.
And, the media can help us get the word out about the processes, because a lot of people who protest and think that there's fraud and ballot harvesting don't really know all the details. I wanted to also, and thanks for people are offering other groups to reach out to. Thanks for those suggestions. There's a question about left-leaning and right-leaning and where the real threat is. And, this is a challenging issue, because we do know there's violence on both sides, but statistically, there is more violence on the right. And we've just seen, if you just look at sheer numbers and numbers of incidents, but we have to be careful not to alienate conservatives in this outreach, because as Bob mentioned, it is essential that they are listened to, that they are included, because even if we have to find those who have left the Republican Party but still call themselves conservatives, our hope is that they will have, sorry about that, that they will have influence on others who lean right. And I mean, I've even heard people talk about, we need a third party. But yes, someone else also mentioned that group status downgrade should be perceived group status downgrade. Absolutely. It's a perception by white people that they are losing their place, that they are losing their power. And it is perceived. It is not, in fact, happening. But there are a lot of theories out there that are frightening folks. So anyway, I just wanted to, and Bob, I don't know if you want to say anything about the, tendency toward violence, right and left. Somebody also wants to have us do a meeting in Cumberland, so we'll see.
Well, I want to respond. I think Pam Jones talked about in one of the slides, we have a picture of an all-black militia group and then a January 6th deal. And her concern is, hey, the real threat is from the right. Okay, friends, you're right. Pam, you're right. The real threat is from the right. Our challenge is, though, if this is presented as, we're doing this because all you crazy Republicans and right wingers are the threat to democracy, we're not going to be able to have the kind of conversations that the Carter Center wants us to have. I mean, it's like, you bring the PLO and the Israelis together to talk, and and somehow, I mean, it's a bit of a tightrope that Jennifer and I are walking in that context, in trying to, I mean, we are impartial in that sense, but we're trying to, at least not on the surface, look like it's all the Republicans' fault, because that will not, that's the communications issue. How do we communicate with ultra conservative right-wing folks about strengthening democracy, fair elections, and I kind of go back to you folks in the church. Okay. I mean, a lot of those folks go to church, and last time I checked, there was only one Bible. Okay. So, there has to be some commonality there and some ability to reach out to them.
And there are, surveys again show us that there are values that all Americans share. People want to have a better place for they want their children to thrive. Family is really important to everybody. Community, they want a strong community. People want neighbors who care for each other. I have a neighbor who cuts someone's grass when they're sick or when they're, unable to do it. I mean, those are the kind of things that we all support. We also all care about our pocketbooks. We want to talk about spending money wisely and not overspending. And we also have this idea that America is a leader, is a shining light on the hill, and we have a can-do spirit. We can overcome this. We recognize problems, and we have all these great groups right now. I run into all the time who are working exactly on the same thing in a different way that we are, but trying to bridge differences. Groups like Braver Angels. Some of you may have heard of them. They were started by a Republican and a Democrat, trying to get people to talk and find those common values in places where they can agree, and then recognize the differences are policy differences, but they're not demonic differences. And that's unfortunately where we're going. I know families that have split up because, mom and dad voted for Trump and the children all voted for Biden, and now they can't talk about anything, including politics, but they can't talk about anything. That is a sign of a troubled country. And that is why the faith voice is so important, because that moral obligation to a better world for our children and their children and 7 generations from now, that moral obligation to your community to help where people can't help themselves, when people are in trouble. Somebody put in the chat, when your mama dies, everybody brings you a casserole, right? They don't ask if you're a Republican or a Democrat when they show up at your door with flowers or something. So those are the kind of things that we need to help emphasize, that we do share a lot, and we should, not be afraid of difference.
Yeah, I see that Wida has her hand up, a Zoom professional. She actually has the little hand up there. Wida, turn your
mic on, ask a question.
Yeah.
I would just say the thought that has come to my heart, my soul, the past couple of days is, who is my neighbor? And I've been doing some work with the We Are group in Durham, who's being attacked politically. And I'm thinking that some of these folks are people who are our neighbors, who are misinformed, who don't realize that this is not about church. This is not about faith. This is about power. Think about, the crossing the lynching tree. That was, all of that stuff didn't happen because of our faith, but they are people, and some need to be informed. I've got a whole list of things where the misinformation is very organized. And if you read these things, you would think, oh, why is my neighbor doing this? But if you see how it's presented media-wise, that, you need to do this. One of the people who's been attacking the director of the organizer for We Are is a newspaper reporter at the N&O. She's also been attacked by Speaker and the Berger and more. It's not faith-based. It's not protecting children. So when people go and protest at these board meetings, they're getting their instruction, marching instructions, not at church. Well, they may be getting some at church, but basically that's not where it's coming from. So I think that's one of the things I've been thinking about. Who is my neighbor who might be misinformed? Who could I share some of this information with? And that kind of thing. Because again, I don't think it's political. I think both parties have been evil at times and done the wrong things. It's time to stand up for what's right and put our faith, out. But anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Wida. And misinformed or different information. Somebody else asked a question: when certain groups have a lot of money to put out their, misleading information. I mean, even a lot of times lies start from a grain of truth, and then they grow wings and fly the opposite direction. But how can we counter that when the other side has so much money? Well, grassroots organizing has shown that money doesn't always win. And there are a lot of candidates who have surprised the pollsters because they were having living room conversations and they were talking to people at their schools and churches, and they were, having town halls that were not necessarily covered by the media, but their word got out, word of mouth. And that's why each one of you in your congregation, in your group of faith, in your HOA, in your neighborhood, in your family, each one of you has the potential to spread a lot of great information, understanding, and outreach. And that's why, we are hoping that a number of groups like this Council of Churches, a number of other groups are going to have this presentation and continue to talk about it in their group meetings, Rotary clubs, all the different groups that know we need our democracy to survive.
Yeah, Steve Ford made a point about the lack of candidates participating in media forums and debates and avoiding it. And I want to sort of glam onto that with a point about the outside money, the dark money, the PACs that are unaccountable. It allows a candidate to say, well, I can't coordinate with them, so I'm just not accountable for what they're saying and what they're doing. And I'm not so, I don't know I know who some of the political consultants are in the state of North Carolina, and I suspect some of them go to church, but really it's the political consultants and these folks driving the third party money, and it's on both sides. I mean, to one extent or another, but it allows a candidate to kind of wash his or her hands of any accountability for untruths and really, really vile attacks. And that's again an accountability factor that we collectively need to be working on if we're going to somehow tamp down the potential for violence and division in the country.
We also have Carol Olinger has her hand up. Well, she said stack, which means she's next. Carol, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for doing this. Thank you. My question is, how can we change the way we're doing things? So like forever, we don't, and depending on your age, we don't discuss politics, and it's been separate for just so long. Religion and politics and voting, it hasn't meshed together. So you go to church and you can go to church with everybody, like the casserole comment earlier, but then when it's time for voting, we're not having those discussions really at church. And then if your pastor happens to not be the same faith, you find that out later, then there's all these different kind of divides. So how can we now, moving forward, to change that? What is there something that we could do or focus on with the Carter Center help?
I'm going to take a shot at that, and then Jennifer, you weigh in. And I'm not really familiar with sort of outreach efforts by, shall we say, more urban, liberal, progressive, or minority community churches to the more Southern Baptist, rural, independent groups. And surely, in the greater scheme of faith, there are mutual issues and mutual efforts that can be joined together. I mean, you don't necessarily have to talk about, who are you supporting in the presidential election, but how do we feed hungry people in the community? What can we do to work together, liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, on mutually agreeable issues? And I think once you start establishing relationships and working together on issues like that, you at least then have the groundwork, the roots sown for, seed sown for building relationships and bridging the divide, and going right back to, the ties that bind. What are those things that hold us together? And I don't know. So, I mean, maybe the Council of Churches has an outreach program. We tend to reach out to various special interest groups. There's some value in reaching out to those that are more conservative and more extreme in some positions, because if they're going to church, you got to have some basis in the tenets of Christianity or Judaism or whatever the faith base may be. So, Jennifer, that's my take.
No, that's terrific. I was actually reading the next question.
Fair enough.
While you were talking, but I do have experience in visiting a lot of churches. I had a very grassroots campaign, both as mayor and county commissioner. I've been to a lot of different styles and formats, and some people are very afraid that mentioning anything political will turn people away, and they're already losing congregants as it is. So I get that. On the other hand, some have bulletins that are willing to put something in the bulletin. If it's a bipartisan, nonpartisan thing that's happening, they're willing to just announce it. Some people have adult forums. They're willing to have it in the adult forum, but not from the pulpit. In fact, I've been invited by Republicans to speak at their adult forums on different, issues when I was in public service. So there are, everybody has a different way of approaching it, and we don't want to divide. And I grew up in the South where you didn't talk religion and politics at the dinner table. I get it. we had a lot of debates in my family that we tried not to have at the dinner table. But we've got to be able to agree to disagree. We've got to be able to be agreeable and civil and appreciate and listen to other views. And that is something that, again, because of the bifurcation of our media sources, we're losing the ability to do. And the fact that candidates are not debating that, that's really harmful. So anytime you can to encourage that to happen. I recognize we're over 1 p.m., but there's still questions coming in. So we love it. I can stay on, Bob can stay on, so we'll keep them going. Somebody mentioned the League of Municipalities and the Association of County Commissioners. Yes, we're reaching out to them. And we do hope that they will allow us to have some kind of an hour presentation for them as well. There are a lot of, I've been a local official. There are so many issues on their table right now with budgets and taxes and police reform and growth and all these things. So we will definitely try to get in any contacts any of you have. If you're, a brother or sister to somebody who's the head of the League of Municipalities or, one of these other groups, please introduce us. That would be an awesome, foot in the door. I find that as a former elected official, my phone calls don't get returned quite as quickly as they used to. So any help is appreciated. Somebody else mentioned a workshop on communications. Absolutely. The Carter Center will be doing some of those later. in the summer as well. Braver Angels has some, there's a peace team in DC that does some of that. So, you know, we're happy to share the resources we have on that, but absolutely we all can, I'm guilty of it myself, of having leading questions like, you didn't get a vaccine? Like, people know right away that you're judging them. So we need to work on that.
Jennifer
Anything
looks like she's ready to pull the plug on us.
Yeah, Jennifer Copeland has put her video back on, so maybe we're nearing the end of our time. I just want to say thank you so much. I'll save my chat, and if there are any unanswered questions, I will reach out via email if you want to put your email in the chat. But thank you so much for giving us this time. Thanks to those who have hung on past one. We really, really, really appreciate your help.
Thank you. I was not trying to cut you off. I just wanted to be ready. Whenever you said enough. I wanted to come back to one question though, maybe you just to think about, Bob mentioned it, about the bus tour. How is it that you selected those 12 or 14 cities to visit? Because we did notice that Cumberland County was not in the list of visited places, but they did show up in the list of potential trouble spots. So just food for thought on adding to your bus tour.
Well, we try to pick one location in each of the 14 congressional districts.
Oh, that
was
okay.
maybe central, you know, like Fletcher. Why are we in the 11th district? Fletcher's kind of in the middle. They have a new African-American 26-year-old mayor, you know, so it seemed like, well, okay. And it's easy to get to, or as easy as you can in a 15 county district. That's the challenge. I mean, we'd love to do it in all 100 counties, but as any statewide candidate would tell you, that's a brutal ambition.
Well, that's a great explanation, though, of course, to pick the congressional districts. Maybe Jennifer, you said that and I missed it the first time through. Well, once again, let me say thanks to the two of you. This has been a delight, to say nothing of educational. It's certainly been educational, but the two of you bring so much energy and enthusiasm to the work that we can't help but be inspired and hope the best as you begin to make these cross connections across North Carolina. So many thanks
for having us. Yeah,
certainly. All right, Rachel, if you'll take us out with our closing litany, I'll invite everybody to mute yourselves and participate by saying the words in dark in your own space. And I will lead this this litany for us today, and it will be our words of parting each day for the rest of the week. God of all the ages, who has seen every nation rise and many nations fall, endow in us the wisdom necessary to be a nation that rises to your call for justice and peace. God of all truth, who sees all eternity in the blink of an eye, bestow upon us the humility to listen to those who differ from us, so that we might know your truth. God of all people, who has marked each of us as holy by creating each of us in your image,
impart to us the courage to create a society where each of us can flourish to the fullness of our ability.
Now go in peace to serve God and your neighbor in all that you do, and may the peace of Christ be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.